Welcome to Nonprofit Impact on MeetAdvisors.com. I'm Megan Dugan-Bassett, your host from Dugan-Bassett Consulting. Our goal is to really dig in and provide tips from leaders in philanthropy, public policy, and direct service about what really works in the nonprofit sector. Today I want to welcome Amber Smock. Amber is the Director of Advocacy at Access Living, a nationally recognized disability advocacy group. And Amber really started working with teenagers and helping them build their leadership skills as advocates for disability rights, and then has moved up over time to be the Director of all advocacy efforts at Access Living. And Amber has actually won numerous awards for her work as an advocate for disability rights. Thank you, Amber, for joining us.
Well,
welcome.
thank you for having me.
So you have a personal interest in disability rights because you have a disability yourself.
That's right. So I am a person with a disability. I have a severe hearing loss. Sometimes I refer to myself as a person who's hard of hearing. Sometimes I refer to myself as a person who is deaf. While I speak for myself, I also often use sign language interpreters in the workplace and video relay interpretation. So that's an example of a person with a disability at work.
Great. So Access Living has been around since 1980, and you do a fantastic job of really pulling together a diverse community of people with disabilities around disability rights. Can you tell us a little bit more about what is the unique role of Access Living in Illinois and nationally?
Okay, well, Access Living, like other centers for independent living around the country, is mandated to have a majority of staff with people with disabilities on board, as well as our board members have to be majority people with disabilities as well. So one unique aspect of Access Living is that when you work with us, you know that the authentic voice of people with disabilities is at the table. And so you're not talking to the gatekeepers, you're not talking to the people around folks with disabilities, you're talking to people who are advocating for what we really want, and that's our niche. So we managed to take that from the local level to the national level to the international level. We're very proud of that.
So tell us a little bit more about what you do at Access Living.
Okay, well, as the Director of Advocacy, I oversee the strategic rollout of all of our efforts to make social change. So we do everything from employment issues to housing issues to healthcare to women and girls issues to community integration. And so what I need to look for is my job involves community organizing and policy and a hotline for people who need help. It's called the Ombudsman Hotline. And so what we want to do is make sure these efforts work together, that they don't clash, but we maximize the impact of what we do. The voice of people with disabilities is out there as much as possible.
Okay, that's great. One of the things that you told me about that I was surprised by was the sheer number of people with disabilities in the U.S. and in Illinois. Can you say a little bit more about just how broad that community is?
Okay, so there are, according to the Illinois Department of Public Health, about 2 million people with disabilities that live in the state of Illinois. In the city of Chicago, that number is about 600,000. In Chicago Public Schools, the number of students with disabilities number is about 45,000.
Wow.
So when we talk about people with disabilities, we are not talking about people we don't know. We are talking about the people who are all around us. And let me also say that most people will say that 1 in 5 persons has a disability, but when it comes to mental health in particular, it may be as many as 1 in 4.
Oh, wow.
So it's all around us.
Yeah. So it's much more widespread than people think about. So I want to kind of break it down a little bit. I think for a lot of nonprofits, they're pinching pennies, and sometimes they make the mistake of ignoring people with disabilities because they think it's going to be costly or it's going to be difficult. But you really think that they're really missing out, that there are a lot of benefits to hiring people with disabilities, to integrating access into nonprofits, budgeting and strategic planning processes. Can you say a little bit more about why nonprofits should make this a priority?
Well, first of all, every possible issue that nonprofits are working on has a disability angle to it. But unless you have someone on staff who has a disability, who is actively working for that voice within the organization, it's very easy to overlook that particular angle. So that's one benefit to having an active person with a disability working for a nonprofit, is because they will help make sure that that particular angle is covered. If you're a nonprofit working on housing, for example, housing is so important to people with disabilities. It needs to be accessible, it needs to be affordable, and it needs to be integrated. You need to have somebody inside the organization who preferably has a disability or disability experience talking about that. So what happens is if you work on issues and you leave out the disability component, you leave yourself open to possibly, well, first of all, embarrassment, because you forgot to cover this particular issue in what you do. Second of all, if you are legally responsible for whatever it is that you're working on, you may be open to being sued. I mean, there is a reason why there's disability civil rights laws. It is for legal action if necessary. And the third thing is that so many people with disabilities are really awesome people. And you lose out on the component of knowing somebody who's different than you, knowing how to work with people who handle things in a different way. And I think that everybody is better for it when disability is in the workplace and it's out.
Yeah, I think that's a great perspective on it. So I'm just wondering so I want to talk about two things before we close. One is, if nonprofits want to do something that's cost effective, what are cost effective ways that they can be integrating access into what they're already doing, into their planning processes?
Well, the first thing you need to do is listen. Listening's free. But I think that sometimes nonprofits assume that in order to be accessible, they have to do everything. And for example, if you host an event and you decide to make it accessible, but you're not really sure people with disabilities are going to be coming, then you may find yourself actually putting out expense to make sure the event is accessible when there's not anybody with a disability who will show up that needs whatever you've decided to do. And so I've had experiences sometimes where people coordinating events will hire interpreters for all possible aspects of it, and I don't actually need interpreters for every single little thing. And so what happens is they have money flying out the window because they didn't plan well. So the first thing that you should do is, if you're hosting public events, ask the person with the disability, or make it clear that you have someone within the organization who's there to answer these kinds of questions. When you don't really know, that's when people start getting into trouble. So that's one thing. Another thing is that you can be more cost effective if you plan ahead. And so this is why it's important that in your annual budget planning, consider allocating a budget to cover excess costs as needed. That's important. In strategic planning, think about how are you going to go forward and address the issue of access throughout your organization. So making sure that you have that built into the strategic plan helps you stay accountable to coming back and saying, what are we doing to make sure we are accessible? And last of all, you never know. You know, there are people with disabilities who want to work full-time. There are people with disabilities who want to work part-time. I actually think there's quite a pool of part-time disability work, people with disabilities who want to work. And folks don't take advantage of that. And so just consider the fact that not every person with a disability is out looking for full-time work. And you may have part-time opportunities in your organization that you could fill with somebody with a disability. So,
what are ways, because there are so many different disabilities, so people have different challenges, there's different needs, how can nonprofits make sure that they're meeting them? Let's say they hire one or two people who have different needs. How can they get a broader knowledge of what else is needed?
Well, first and foremost, the way that most people come into contact with your organization is going to be your website. And so one question that I have is, does your website make it clear that you want to hear from people with disabilities? Where do you put that? Do you put it on the front page? Is it in your About Us section? Where do we find out who we can talk to about disability? That's very important. Second, you know, there are continual learning opportunities throughout the city of Chicago to learn about people with disabilities. You can take the effort and make a field trip for an hour to a disability organization and say, I just want to tour your organization. I just want to learn about your organization. There's a lot you can get from those kinds of meetings. And then you should also look to your personal connections, I think. I think it's worth thinking about, do I know people with disabilities? Do I know someone with HIV? Do I know someone who has diabetes? Do I know someone with cancer? Do I know someone who uses a chair or is blind or is deaf? All of these are disabilities that are actually legally covered under the ADA. And I think a lot of folks think, well, you know, I just have a little trouble walking. Or I just can't do that. But in reality, that is a legally covered disability. So I think looking to your personal connections and then making those overtures to other organizations to learn is very important.
Okay, that's great. That's really helpful. The last question I wanted to ask you is, if you were going to pick just a few things that are, regardless of costs, that are the most important things that nonprofits can be doing, particularly social service organizations, to make access part of their work or to make their work more accessible? What would be those few things that you would say?
Well, I think, first of all, recognize that there is a disability world and they do have projects going on, and find ways to connect with them. That's important. That's easy for a lot of people to do. It's very hard for a nonprofit to self-start a whole disability initiative without any help.
Right.
So I think connection is important. Second, I think understanding that the world of disability often means people who are hidden or people who are segregated.
Right.
And so keeping an eye out for where are people. Are they in that nursing home? Or are they in that residential school? Or are they on the streets? You know, people with disabilities are so often hidden people that paying attention to those sectors will suddenly force you to start thinking about disability in a new way. So I think those are important things that I want people to know. And last of all, I want people to know that, you know, in my world, people talk about disability pride a lot. And it's hard having a disability. I have to say that. But there's connection and there's bond between people who understand that they face similar access barriers, and that's actually something to leverage. It's very great to have a lot of people with disabilities come together to advocate for something, and to have people with disabilities who are not, people without disabilities, come with us and be part of something. So I think considering the power of disability to mobilize people is very important for any nonprofit.
That's great. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you speaking with us. It's been really, really useful information. Look for more interviews with great nonprofit leaders on meetadvisors.com.